I live in a mountainous and forested region on the border of Canada and the US. I pretty frequently go for hikes and sometimes even camp a night or two, and usually I go in with no real plan in mind. I'll search up an uncommon trail and just see where it takes me. I think it's the thrill of not knowing what I'll see that makes it so enjoyable. In case of emergencies though, I always go prepared with multiple methods of navigation because you just never know. Anyway, I was out on a hike in early summer this year. It was just as I said, some random trail in the middle of the forest near my cabin. I'd never been on it before, but I'd initially found it intersecting a trail that I was on several weeks prior. This one was very faint, just as most of them were out here, but this one often had me wondering if it was even a trail at all, or if I was just imagining a path that didn't actually exist. About 2 hours in though, I started to recognize shoe prints along some of the more muddy parts of the trail. There would only be a few at a time, and most of them didn't seem to actually follow the path. They would be going across it, or sometimes walking along it for a minute, then abruptly turning off. Then after an hour, I came across a section of the trail that was a bit more defined, having tons of shoe prints scattered across and through it, as if someone constantly came across this part. I looked up, and just ahead was a cabin. I put two and two together, assuming someone had set up an off-grid place, but as I looked at the cabin more closely, something about it didn't look right. All of the shoe prints I'd seen had to be less than a few days old, but this cabin seemed to have not been lived in for years. The door was wide open, barely hanging from its hinges, and some parts at the bottom of the cabin were so weathered it was sinking into the ground. I got a closer look, entering the area around it that had been cleared of trees. I don't know what it was about this place, but it really intrigued me, and I almost felt like I needed to see if someone needed help, because the recent shoe prints in the rundown cabin didn't add up. I stepped up to the open door, and right away, I caught a whiff of a horrible odor, almost indescribable. And as I peered inside, it was clear that this place was not lived in. There were signs of wild animals nesting inside, and the forest was growing through the floorboards. I walked in carefully and tried to see what I could, but the smell was so bad I just couldn't continue past a few feet. I turned around to leave, and instantly felt my stomach drop as a figure was staring at me from the forest. They immediately took off running, hiding in the density of the trees. I did the same, running through the trees somewhat along the path, going as far as I could until I felt safe. When I got home, I called it in to report the strange behavior and creepy abandoned cabin. I knew that something was going on there. It took several days for a party to go out and investigate, with my help in showing them the way. But when we arrived, all that was left of the cabin were black ashes and charred wood. It had been burned down. To this day, there's been nothing to show from the creepy nature of that cabin and the man I'd seen in the forest, but it's pretty clear he had something to hide, something that he was covering up. And I fear that if I had stayed any longer or had gone further into the cabin, I would have not made it out. I'm an officer for our local police department. Shifts in our department are always switching around, having people work 10 to 12 hours on a different schedule every week, sometimes overnight, followed by early morning, and then overnight again. On this day, I was working 10 p.m. to 10 a.m. and was at the office when a dispatcher notified me of a call about a group of teenagers trespassing on private property. Specifically, it was a hospital on the outskirts of town that had been deserted for the last decade. This was a common place for groups to hang out and do various illegal activities at, and the whole department knew about this, and most of us had been there several times before. This was my fourth time having gone there, and I was sure it would be a quick and typical case of walking in and either escorting a group of friends out or watching them run off. I was tired, so either was good enough for me. I honestly didn't care too much to arrest and charge them. I just needed them to leave the property. When I got there, I was quickly aware of a flashlight shining through the windows of the second story. What was strange about it was that it was moving really fast across multiple windows, like someone was running through the hallway. I got out of my vehicle and prepped my flashlight, then entered the building. First thing I did was call out, requesting everyone to show themselves and whatnot. But of course, no one did. I listened at the entrance for any noises to hopefully give me an idea of where to look, but it was dead silent. Enough so to wake me up and get my nerves going, having me keep my right hand on the holster of my gun. I think it was always a slight fear that it could be a trap to lead in an officer and attempt something, but I kept my cool and walked through the old hallway and up the flight of stairs. It was as I reached the top that a thud echoed through the building. It sounded like someone hitting a wall and was definitely from the second floor. I entered the hallway and shined my flashlight all the way down, not seeing anyone or even a sign of anyone. I called out again, very aggressively, knowing that the stairs I was by were the only way up and down from the second story. I stayed there and listened again, but heard nothing more than the creaking of the building. I walked slowly through the hallway, looking through each door and scanning the rooms with my flashlight, but there was nothing more than old hospital beds and graffiti. When I got to the last room, the door was closed, so I called out one more time before swinging it open. I cleared the room, but nobody was inside. However, there were signs of recent activity, being cigarettes on the ground with smoke still rising from them. This was extremely concerning, knowing that they hadn't left the second floor through the stairs, and the only other way was if they had jumped out a broken window. Before I could even check, the door behind me slammed shut, followed by something smashing against it and footsteps departing down the hallway. Luckily, I was able to forcefully push the door open enough to slide through the opening, seeing that a large hospital bed was pressed against it. By the time I got out, whoever was there was long gone. Backup came, and we did a more thorough investigation, also checking in with the one who originally called in the two teenagers. What was odd about this was that there was only one clear set of footsteps I heard, and only one flashlight in the window. The cigarettes still burning also showed that they had left in a hurry, which could have been from me arriving, but then why would one of them have stayed behind? In the morning, we got a report from a mother on her missing teenage son, followed soon after by an identical report by another mother on her teenage son. After looking into it for days, and then weeks, and then months, it was almost definite that they were not going to show up. And now, 6 years later, they still haven't. Their disappearance is an unlikely one, and that's what makes it so difficult. It isn't certain whether or not the person in the hospital with me was one of the two kids, but the current most stable theory is that it was someone else. And unless something more comes up, it's not likely that we'll ever know. I live in a really small countryside town. The population's only a few thousand, and the nearest city is a couple hours away, but most of the people that live here are close. With there being so few people, everyone knew everyone, and everyone knew everything that was going on in the town. At the time, I was in high school and had a best friend, Chris, that I'd hang out with pretty much every day. During mid-fall, there was a lot of talk about an empty farmhouse in the town that people were exploring. I was never one to do these sorts of things, but Chris was, and I'd be lying if I said I wasn't curious. Supposedly, this farmhouse had been left behind by the owners years ago, left to rot on the edge of town for the past 5 years. Being in high school now, the rumors of it spread like a wildfire as people were telling stories about it and daring others to explore it. And it was on one weekend night that Chris brought it up to me. We had nothing else to do, and Chris seemed really excited to see what everyone was talking about. And after finding a couple flashlights, we got in the car and drove to the farmhouse. We only knew which road it was on, but it wasn't very hard to find. From the road, you could see the rotting house in the distance, but we couldn't find the driveway. It was likely that it had been overgrown and might have not even existed anymore, so we parked on the road and started walking through the field toward the house. It was almost 1 a.m., so the moon was lighting up the field just enough for us to navigate through it. As we got closer, it almost felt like the night got quieter and quieter until we reached it. The house had weeds infesting the whole yard and vines growing through the wooden panels on the outside. Chris led the way, walking around to the front where the door was missing, giving us easy access inside. We stepped in and started walking through the rooms, looking at the trash on the ground and the decaying interior, making both of us wonder why it was even abandoned to begin with. After a minute or two though, we'd seen everything on the first floor and moved up to the second. It was much darker upstairs, almost like there were no windows to let in the moonlight. We both turned on our flashlights and shined them around. There were only 2 rooms up there, one on the left side of the hallway and the other on the right. Chris went up to the left, finding that the door was locked. While he was struggling with that door, I went into the other room that happened to be unlocked. It was entirely empty, having mold on the ceiling and nothing more, but there was a single window with slabs of wood nailed to it. Curious by it, I went up to it and wondered why they needed to block an upstairs window. I crouched down to investigate and looked in between 2 of the slabs to see what was outside the window, thinking maybe it had access to the roof or something, but it didn't. This window was just facing the field we came from, and as I looked out into the moonlit grass, I saw a figure walking toward the farmhouse not too far away. I quickly left the window and whispered to Chris that someone was coming here. My heartbeat was already speeding up. I think it was seeing the figure being alone that really freaked me out, knowing it wasn't just some other kids exploring the place. Chris looked nervous too, walking over to the window to see for himself, but we immediately stopped at the sound of footsteps entering the house downstairs. We froze in place, standing in the middle of the empty room, too scared to even take a step and risk being found. The person walked slowly through the first floor, going to the stairs and beginning to walk up. Both Chris and I just stared at the open doorway, listening to the footsteps reach the top and start coming even closer, until the large figure of a man appeared in front of us. He was facing the other way, unlocking the locked door as he stood in the dark hallway just 4 or 5 feet from us. I was holding my breath, just hoping he wouldn't turn around, but when he opened the door, I locked eye contact with another man who was standing on the far side of the other room. Our gaze was broken when the man went into the room and closed the door behind him, but we heard them whispering immediately after. Chris and I made our move, sprinting into the hallway and down the stairs, hearing the door swing open and footsteps charging behind us as we fled the house and ran for the field. We didn't stop until we got to the car, driving away. The whole ride back to my house, neither of us said a word. We were both just in shock and taking everything in. We had no idea what was going on in that house or who those 2 men were, but out of fear of getting in trouble for trespassing, we didn't call the police. We were stupid to have even gone there, and I won't defend any of my actions, but I feel like there was something more going on at that farmhouse. A month after that incident, the house was bought and torn down with no reason given, and whether or not something was going on in there will probably never be known for sure.